was common enough that a person was saying nothing in order to defend or protect, say, members of their families. So sometimes the Inquisition sought no alternative but to order torture.
But what heresy was so serious and damaging that it required the establishment of an Inquisition? Examination of the records reveals the answer. Quite simply, being Jewish. Medieval Europe was not a pleasant place to be Jewish. Tensions between Jews and Christians had been strained since the days of the New Testament. Christian teaching at the time stated that the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ, and they refused to accept him as the Son of God. Jews were persecuted at various times in many European countries. It wasn't difficult to stir up anti-Jewish feelings in 14th century Christendom. All that was needed was something or someone to ignite the fuse of hatred.
Communities can live together peacefully for generations in medieval Spain, I suppose, just as in the Balkans today. It doesn't go beyond local politics until, that is, somebody decides that it's in their interests to make a bigger issue out of these tensions.
A well-known anti-Jewish preacher named Ferran Martínez did just that. In 1391, he exploited a temporary lack of church leadership in Seville and used his position to incite actual physical violence against local Jews. In scenes that echo the early persecutions of Jews in Nazi Germany, a Christian mob marched into the city's Jewish quarter. They trapped hundreds in the narrow alleys and began a series of assaults. So intense was the violence and panic that in one particular street, hundreds of Jews lost their lives. The street is now known as Calle de la Muerte, the Street of the Dead. Between June and August of that year, a wave of mob violence and attacks on Jews spread across the whole of Spain, from Seville in the south to Barcelona in the north. The death toll was in the thousands. The next 100 years, Spain was full of brooding anti-Semitism. The power and influence of the Catholic Church continued to grow, demanding an unquestioning conformity to the one true faith, Christianity. Under this pressure, over 150,000 Jews fled Spain, but over 250,000 remained. They renounced their religious and cultural heritage and converted to Christianity, at least on the surface. In the small back streets of Cordoba is an abandoned synagogue. This building is extraordinary simply because it still exists. It's one of only 3 medieval synagogues in all of Spain that still stands. Some were converted into churches, but most were destroyed. The new converts, or conversos as they were known, were now able to take up positions in society that had been the exclusive preserve of Christians. Many conversos were more than happy to exploit this benefit of their new religion.
There's a very famous case of the rabbi of Burgos converting to Catholicism and becoming the bishop of Burgos. And this has got to raise some eyebrows if you think, how sincere can anyone be, be the rabbi and then turn around and become the bishop? It just doesn't make sense. Some people might be suspicious of it.
The rivalry, the animosity, those feelings of, at times, real hatred by the old Christians to the Jewish communities wasn't just about religion. It was also about competition for jobs and for status, because those areas where Jewish families were allowed to make their living were restricted by the crown. But if they became new Christians, if they became converted members of the mainstream Christian community, what was to stop them moving in and taking the jobs of the old Christians?
For a century, resentment and suspicion grew. The Jews who had converted and become successful outside the Jewish community were the most suspect of all in the eyes of the old Christians. The old Christian population believed that these new converts were not true Christians, that their new faith was a sham, that they still practiced Judaism in secret. Not surprisingly, when the Inquisition was created, its first targets were these conversos. The Inquisition was the first formal mechanism to cleanse Spain of false belief. The Inquisition was organized and methodical. It appointed teams known as tribunals and sent them all over Spain to uncover and exterminate heresy. The size of the tribunal varied, but had at its core a Grand Inquisitor, the boss. He was supported by 2 other inquisitors. They had at their disposal the scribe and the services of a doctor to monitor the health of suspects, because the suspects might end up in the hands of the torturer, hired from the civil authorities to extract just that little bit more. But what each tribunal also needed, more than anything else, was suspects. Heresy was surely being committed. It was just a matter of finding the heretics. How did the Inquisition go about it? The first step was to ask for volunteers. Many people willingly came forward. This was a good way for old Christians to show what good Catholics they were, to confess, receive a penance, and be forgiven. The Inquisition welcomed such confessions, issuing small penances and reconciling the person back into the church. This worked well, but only for petty offences, which wasn't quite what the Inquisition was after. They impressed upon the population that it was their Christian duty to actively assist the Inquisition. In other words, to betray their friends, neighbours, and family. Even this wasn't enough, so further evidence was gathered by using informants, Inquisition spies. These spies were known as familiares, and they were rewarded for their spying and betrayal with elevated social standing. They scrutinized the lifestyles of their neighbors, eavesdropping on conversations, reporting anything suspicious back to the Inquisition. With no state intelligence force to call upon, the Inquisition developed methods that were both ingenious and effective.
The only way it can collect information is by inviting the public to participate. It has no secret archives, it has no database, it just sits there and asks people to come to it with what they know about the practice of religion by their neighbors. It is a system based on the populace as a whole participating in a great movement of espionage on their own neighbors.
This was one of the darkest aspects of the Spanish Inquisition, and it would invariably lead to a knock on the door under the cover of darkness.
You would find that at dead at night, the Inquisition would come, the house would be surrounded, you would be arrested with everybody else in the house, with your wife, with your family. You would then be taken in a closed carriage to the Inquisition prison.
Once they had their suspect behind bars, the Inquisition employed procedures that were truly sinister.
The Inquisition never let the accused know who was giving the evidence against him. And this is one of the first things which opponents of the Inquisition in the early years of its establishment denounced very, very strongly. They said secret testimony is illegal. And of course it was illegal. It was not allowed by the laws, normal laws of Spain. But the Inquisition said, we must have it, because if we do not have it, we cannot proceed adequately. And so here we get the beginning of a chain of injustices which begins the big problem of the Inquisition and its procedures.
To give the outward appearance of a justice system, an Inquisition prisoner did have the right to a defense attorney. But mounting any sort of credible defense was almost impossible. The Inquisition not only hid the identity of your accusers, they wouldn't even reveal the nature of the crime you'd been accused of.
If you were investigated by the Inquisition, I think a great sense of desperation must have come over you, because you didn't